What's going on, guys? In this video we are going over the hero's journey and how understanding this can have a huge impact on your life. Be sure to stick with me to the end on this one. It's going to be a longer video, but I promise you if you stick around and understand this information, it's going to have a huge impact on your ability to orient yourself in the world so that you can feel better and just feel like you're on the right path in life. I know it's had that impact on me. Before we get into that, my name's Keith. I made this channel to help men create their ideal lives through self-mastery. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss tomorrow's video. Hit the bell icon. Let's get straight into it. So the way I figured would be the most logical way to go about making this video would be to, rather than go step by step through the hero's journey, I'm going to pick out the most important aspects of the hero's journey. I'm going to lay them out, and then I'm going to give you story examples as well as real life examples so you can figure out how to apply this concept to your own life. The gist of the hero's journey at the end of the day, though, is it's about self-discovery. It's a pathway from going from a place you're at now to a more enlightened part of your life. That is, really any part of your life where you go through a transformation would be considered a hero's journey. Now, these things have been, the hero's journey originally was an idea that came from the Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell type of people in the early 20th century, but essentially this is a mythological narrative that has been around throughout all cultures and all times. Why do you think just about every movie seems to follow a very similar plot line? It's because they're modeling after and understanding a symbolic representation of what we go through in our own lives on an external basis, but more importantly on an internal basis as far as our own internal transformation. So the first part of the hero's journey, the first major step, is living in the ordinary world. Now, this is the time in your own personal life where you have not yet had a major transformation occur. Now, this story is not necessarily linear, and you're going through different phases of it at different times in your life on different subjects, but essentially the ordinary world would be almost like living in the Matrix. You're kind of living in a world, and there's a lot that you don't realize yet that you are soon to discover, and it's going to have a real impact on your worldview and help you evolve as a person. Some good examples from literature and movies are Luke Skywalker, when he's like a farm boy on Tatooine, and he's looking up at the sun, and he just, like, you can tell through the story that he feels like there's more to his life than what he's doing living on this desert planet out in the middle of nowhere. That's him living in the ordinary world, but he's got this gut feeling that he's meant to do more. In your own life, this happens all the time. Maybe it's right before you decide, like, I'm not fulfilled with my job, or I'm not happy in this relationship, and you're really feeling like there's something more out there for you, essentially. The second major step in the hero's journey is the call to adventure, which would have to come right after the ordinary world, and this is when something happens, whether maybe it's a piece of information you learn or something like that. Something occurs that causes you to change your perspective, change your worldview, or make a decision to leave your ordinary life behind and go out and make something new happen. A good example of this could be in Batman Begins, when Bruce Wayne is in the prison and Ra's al Ghul comes in and invites him to go up to the temple on the mountain where he could learn to fight true injustice in the world. This is an example of he was invited to go on an adventure, or he could choose to stay fighting criminals in the street like he was doing before that. Another good example of this is when Frodo in Lord of the Rings is given the ring by Gandalf and is told he needs to leave the Shire with the ring, and you'll notice that there's a part where he tells Gandalf he doesn't want the ring, he doesn't want the responsibility, and this is also part of the resistance to the call, which happens a lot of times when it comes to this. But Gandalf insists, so Frodo takes the ring and he accepts the call to adventure, and essentially what happens at the call to adventure is you begin down this path of, like, no return, really. What happens if you fail to accept this call is oftentimes you live an unfulfilling life. This is when you lack the courage to step out of your comfort zone, really, so you know there's something you really want to do but you don't do it. Perhaps the call to adventure for you could be to go up to a girl that you really want to approach, but you decide to stay in your comfort zone, and so you kind of feel bad, you feel less confident in yourself for doing it. This is like a small example, so it's not like you're going to beat yourself up for the rest of your life over it, most likely, but if you had accepted that call to adventure, gone up and talked to the girl, you just never know what could have happened from there on. The third major part of the hero's journey is the crossing of the first threshold. This is essentially the point of no return, where you have committed to the adventure, essentially. So, like in our example I just used about the girl and approaching her, perhaps this would be you actually approach the girl. You have just crossed the threshold. There's no going back. You have done it now. In movies, a good example is Neo, when he accepts and takes the red pill you know, once he's taken the red pill, he goes down the rabbit hole. There's no way back. He can't unsee what he has seen, and now he is forever changed, and he basically has no choice but to continue onward with the path forward. Some real life examples of this could be if you chose to quit a job that was unfulfilling to you. You can't go back to the job. You've quit the job, and now you have to choose. Like maybe you quit a job to start a business or something like that, or perhaps you just learned a piece of information that you really could not unsee this piece of information, and it really changed your worldview. A personal example from my life is when I committed to doing real estate. I decided I wasn't going to get my 4-year degree, and I committed to doing my real estate license. There was no going back at that point. I mean, sure, I could have gone back to college, but metaphorically speaking, in the sense of the hero's journey, I had made the commitment. There was no going back. I had changed my trajectory of my life, and I had committed to new things and a new adventure that really inspired me. The next major step of the hero's journey is tests, allies, and enemies. So this has to do with the challenges that will be faced, because make no mistake, when you accept the call to adventure, when you go on the hero's journey, you will face challenges, and this is an essential part of the process. And this is a really important thing to understand, because a lot of guys, they think they're doing something wrong if they have to go through some struggle, but the point is, like, that's just kind of necessary. It's necessary externally so that you learn lessons about, like, whatever it is you're doing. Like, for example, if you're in business, you're going to have to learn from mistakes you make so that you can improve your business model. But internally, people don't understand that the true change that occurs when you accept the call to adventure is the internal change. It's not the external world that changes as much as the internal. You have to change from being, let's say, an unsuccessful person to a successful person. Let's say it has to do with girls. You have to change from being a guy who's scared to talk to girls, who's like a virgin at a late age or something like that, to a guy who's comfortable talking to girls, who understands how to be the kind of man a girl wants. These are internal changes, and the only way you can go through them is experiencing challenges that test who you really are, because otherwise you'll just stay the same. Now, when it comes to allies and enemies along your journey, what happens when you make these changes is a lot of people are going to leave your life. Make no mistake, if you accept the call to adventure, the people who are still following the crowd, the sheep who haven't woken up, are not going to like this, and you're going to lose most of them. But along the way, you're going to gain new friends as well. You can think of when Luke Skywalker again is leaving Tatooine. He meets Han Solo and Chewbacca. He goes on the Millennium Falcon, and he's basically created his gang that are going to go with him on this adventure. Another one is Harry Potter meeting Hermione and Ron Weasley, and then he also meets the adversary Malfoy. So essentially these dynamics start to take place. A lot of times you might meet mentors over the internet, for example, as well. This is another thing that can happen. A real life example of this could be perhaps you quit a job, you start the new job, as we've been talking about as an example, and there's this learning curve, right? So maybe during the learning curve you're doubting it. You're like, man, I should have stayed my other job, because you're like, it's new, it's chaotic, it's like you haven't gotten a grip for it yet. And so there's this learning curve where you have to figure things out, and with that comes some fear and anxiety and perhaps regret, and you're wondering if you've made the right decision. Next part of the hero's journey is the ordeal. Now, the ordeal is essentially like hitting rock bottom, and I think it's, again, really important to note that this is actually in the hero's journey story, in every movie you watch, basically, and as well as just in Joseph Campbell's writing about the hero's journey. He talks specifically about this actually being a part of the journey, is the ordeal, is the fact that you hit rock bottom. And again, this is something to expect. We all want to ignore the fact that this is going to happen, but it's just part of it. And when you're going through it, it's awful. But I personally can tell you, having gone through like a really hard one of these, I can tell you this is probably the most important part of the journey, because if you can get through it, you're just completely renewed when you get through it. A couple examples of this from movies are like when Bruce Wayne again finds himself in the pit in The Dark Knight Rises, when Bane has put him in that pit in the desert, and this is essentially his rock bottom moment. He's watching his city get burnt down, and what it is really, it's a psychological representation at the end of the day, because like I said, a lot of this is about internal transformation as well as the outside world changing as a result of your inner world changing. But you notice how in the pit, Bruce Wayne is hit with psychological terror. Essentially, he has to feel the brunt of the idea that he has completely failed, and he has to travel to the deepest parts of himself. Because remember, in the end, when he gets out of the pit, it's because he reintegrates his fear of dying. Essentially, he reintegrates that part of himself that he had kind of shunned in order to regain his true power. And this only happens when you go through the real fire of just the pain of hitting hitting rock bottom. Another example is when Luke Skywalker gets his arm cut off and he discovers from Darth Vader that Darth Vader is his father. Part of the ordeal in hitting rock bottom is the self-discovery. That is the purpose of it, because you kind of realize that you are insufficient before this point, because if you had been sufficient as a person, you wouldn't have found yourself in this position. And so everybody has to go through that point where they discover that there was something they were missing. Their worldview was wrong. They were looking at things wrong, and they had to learn some things, but it requires true pain and transformation, the way that a phoenix has to burn up and then rebirth itself. It's the same idea here occurring. You have to truly understand something deep within yourself and then reintegrate that part of you, and that's what happens down here when you're in the ordeal phase. Personal story for me was as a whole life experience, I went through my ordeal phase a little over a year ago, and what was happening, that's when it started. At least it lasted a couple months, but during that time I genuinely just really was like, okay, if I died, like I felt awful. And that's a real part of it, especially if it's happening on like a whole life, like your entire life is going through the ordeal stage. Like certain parts of your life perhaps are going through an ordeal stage individually, and it's a lot more manageable, right? Because it's kind of like part of your life kind of dissipates, but you can figure it out. But when your whole life goes through it, it's very difficult. I'd had relationship end very badly. My self-esteem had just been ruined. My entire like vision for my life financially had kind of crumbled down. My friend group I'd had to that point had pretty much dissipated. Like everything I had understood about where I was in the world and my place and my direction basically just dissolved beneath my feet. And essentially in this point I had to discover the things I was missing within myself. And now that I've gone through it, I can tell you, like, going through it was so essential to my rebirth as an individual and coming out stronger. I feel better than I've ever felt. So like if you're going through this stage right now, or you have, just know, like, you're gonna feel better on the end as long as you get through it and you discover what you need to discover from it. And only you're gonna be able to know that for yourself. But I can tell you, like, I feel better than I've ever felt in my life. I feel more clear on where I'm going. Things work better for me than they've ever worked. I'm just like, literally everything works better once you go through that phase, but you just have to go through it, and it really sucks while you're going through it. The sixth stage here is the reward. Now the reward is really more about interchange. Like I said, it's about you discover where you were inadequate as an individual psychologically, and you reintegrate that part of yourself, and essentially your worldview has now dramatically expanded. You can see more clearly. You've taken the blinders off. It's kind of like you leaving the house of mirrors essentially, and you've discovered something that you needed to discover. Symbolically, this gets represented in movies perhaps as like finding love, or getting some sort of object bestowed upon you, perhaps like pulling the sword out of the stone, that kind of moment where you've integrated something and you can get a reward out of it. Good example from literature is Luke Skywalker again, when he faces Vader. So he's gotten his arm cut off, and that's going through the ordeal, right? He discovers that which he hates most, essentially his biggest enemy, Darth Vader, is actually his father. He has to figure that out, and then he gets his arm cut off in the process. But afterwards, the reward is he accepts this and he chooses to do the right thing with it, right? So now he goes about, then in the next movie, he's going about the process of trying to bring his father back from the dark side. He's trying to do the right thing, and he has integrated this part of it, and he's accepted who he is, and he's accepted this part of it. And you can see how, like in episode 4 and 5 of the series, he's really not that capable of a Jedi. And he's like obviously like a naturally gifted person, but he just has not completely like grown into his own. Whereas in the 6th movie, you can see that he's got like a new lightsaber, which is essentially like a symbol of this, right? He goes from the blue lightsaber to the green lightsaber. His whole like demeanor has really changed to that of more of mastery of himself, and this is only done because he goes through that ordeal and integrates that part of himself. Unfortunately, the reward is not the last step. As you know, like for example, Luke Skywalker still has more to go in the path, and the next step is the return home. A good example of this is Simba when he has to go home and face Scar. He has to now go back to the kingdom and reclaim it, essentially by defeating the enemy, essentially. Again, Luke Skywalker as an example, his return is when he goes to he has to go pursue Vader, and he wants to get Vader back to the light side. They have to defeat the Empire once and for all. Essentially, in your own life, this would be like, perhaps now you've gone through your ordeal, you've understood what it is you needed to understand, and now that you have that part of you integrated, it is now your responsibility and obligation to go after that which kind of like held you back last time, or fix the problems that were in your life, or just essentially use that information you now have to better your life. After this stage comes the resurrection stage, and this is when the stakes are at their highest. Essentially, this is the moment where you, the hero, are really facing up against that which is your adversary, essentially in your own life or psychologically. Good examples of this, like when Luke Skywalker goes up against the Emperor, and the stakes are their highest, right? The people down on the planet, they might get killed by the Death Star if he doesn't act fast enough. He's literally, Luke Skywalker's life is on the line, and it's essentially all the stakes are at their highest, and it takes everything from the journey beforehand to defeat now the adversary at this moment. Now, after you go through the resurrection phase, though, you get the Elixir. This is the final stage. It's called Return with the Elixir. Now, essentially what this means is the hero has gone full circle, and he can now implement everything that he's taken and create massive change in his own life because he has defeated that enemy. So Luke Skywalker defeats the Emperor. Frodo destroys the ring. And what do they do afterwards? Like, they've now integrated and essentially defeated this big adversary in their life, and now they have the option to kind of move forward, essentially. So, like, it's said that after Luke Skywalker defeats the Empire, he's supposed to rebuild the Jedi Order, and Frodo, after he destroys the ring, he goes to the other land with the elves. He leaves Middle-earth. Batman, after he saves Gotham City in The Dark Knight Rises, he leaves and goes to like Europe, and he's supposedly dead, and he runs off with Anne Hathaway's character. Essentially, they have now gone full circle. They've integrated this part, and now they can kind of leave that part behind and move into the next step of their life. So it's essentially like you have conquered something, and you've just fully integrated this into yourself. This is kind of the moment when you essentially get crowned king of your own kingdom, essentially. Now, as I've been saying, this can happen on a specific area, or it can happen in your whole life, and you're going to experience this a lot of times in your life. This is it's not always a linear process. A lot of times it can be linear, and you can kind of look at different moments and pinpoint them, but like for me, example, like a lot of times it seems like perhaps I'll go through another phase before I complete the entire journey in my cycle. And again, you might be in multiple places at different times. Like, for example, for me right now, I think just as a whole, like psychologically as a person, I have reached the return with the Elixir stage. I've left a lot of baggage from my life psychologically behind. I've made big changes in myself. I just feel better than I've ever felt, and I feel like I'm in a place to create anew. I've like flipped over and I've started a new chapter. When it comes to finances, I feel like I'm more in the return home journey. Like, I am facing up against it. I'm building my money up. I've got the careers lined up and the businesses lined up that I want, and essentially it's about now facing off against my adversaries in that, like adversaries, like metaphorically speaking, in that area, to acquire the financial gain so that then I can defeat that area of my life, essentially king myself essentially financially, and then go on to new financial adventures. But right now it's about the financial adventures of getting financial stability, or getting new car, getting like investment properties, things like that, building businesses. That's where I'm at right now. And then ultimately you move into the next stage of that part of your life, and you accept the next call to adventure. So the full journey is actually 12 steps. I think I went over 9 of them in this video. I left out a few that I just felt like they were smaller kind of steps that you didn't need to know to get the gist of this video. I didn't want it to get too long of a video. But basically, the concept here has really been vital for me in orienting my life, especially when I found myself in the ordeal stage, when I understood about this hero's journey and understood, you know, it doesn't make it feel any better that you're in the middle of this ordeal. But essentially, if I had not understood that this was part of the process, I would have really felt very hopeless. I would have been like, there's no way out of this ordeal. I mean, I genuinely was like, one day, it was actually my birthday, I was laying in my bed in the middle of the afternoon, just like completely depressed. And I was reading this book, and just something about the book hit me, and I just kind of decided, like, whatever I was going through, I just kind of gave it up to God, honestly. And I think that was a real transformational moment. But if I hadn't understood really in that moment that this was kind of part of the process of developing as a human, as you got to go through this pain, I really don't know where I would have been. Because I mean, This is the kind of people like the people who don't understand this process, who go through these depressive phases in their lives, I think are the ones who end up getting addicted to drugs, or perhaps they commit suicide because they don't have the orientation in their life to understand that this is just part of the process, and you have to integrate new parts of yourself. You have to accept responsibility for your faults and learn what you should have known beforehand. And when you understand this, you can orient your life properly. But guys, I'd love to know what stage of the journey you think you're in right now. Leave a comment down below and take a guess at where you think you're at in your life on the hero's journey. Also, if you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Helps me reach more guys through the algorithm. Be sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss tomorrow's video. I'm going to leave a video right here that I also think you will like. Thanks, guys. I'll talk to you tomorrow.